The crowbar hit something that was not wood. Eleanor Rourke was on her hands and knees on the floor of a freezing mountain cabin, tearing up the floorboards to burn them, because it was 20 below outside, and she had run out of everything else. She was 76 years old, with no money, no home, and no one left in the world who wanted her. And when the crowbar came down again, it did not bite into pine. It rang, a flat, dead, metallic ring, the sound of steel under her hands, buried beneath a floor that was never supposed to have anything under it but frozen dirt. Eleanor sat back on her heels in the dark, her breath clouding, her heart hammering, and very slowly, she began to pull away the boards. But to understand how a woman ended up on that floor, thrown out at 76 by a girl she had raised since the age of 8, we have to go back to a marriage that lasted 30 years, and to 6 words spoken in a church parking lot, because the story of how Eleanor lost everything is the only way to understand how she was about to find $120 million. Eleanor married Thomas Rourke when she was 46, and he was 50. He was a quiet widower, with sawdust worn into his sleeves, and a daughter who would not look at her. Claire was 8 years old at that first dinner. She sat with her arms folded and her chin down, and when Eleanor set a plate in front of her, the girl said, very clearly, "You're not my mother." Eleanor said, "No, I'm not, but I'd like to be your friend, if you'll let me." Claire never let her. Not that year, or the next, or in any of the 30 that followed. Eleanor kept trying anyway. That was simply who she was. She packed the lunches. She sat through school plays. Claire never once looked out at her for. She stayed up the whole night. Claire's heart was first broken, sitting outside a locked bedroom door, talking to a girl who would not answer. She drove 9 hours to a graduation, where Claire hugged her father and shook Eleanor's hand. 30 years of packed lunches, 30 years of a hand held out and never taken. And then Thomas got sick. He was ill for 2 years, and Eleanor nursed him through every day of it. She was holding his hand at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, when the room went quiet. Claire arrived that afternoon. She stood at the foot of the bed, looked at her father's body, and then looked at Eleanor. "You should go home," she said. "I'll handle everything." At the funeral, Claire sat in the front row. Eleanor sat in the second, because when she moved toward the empty seat beside her stepdaughter, Claire set her handbag down on it. Afterwards, in the church parking lot, Eleanor tried one last time. She said, "Claire, I know I was never what you wanted, but we're all each other has now." And Claire, in her expensive black coat, gave her the 6 words that Eleanor would carry up that mountain, and into the cold, and onto that frozen floor. "You were never family, Eleanor." Then she got into her car, and she drove away to begin taking everything. Thomas had left a will. It was simple and it was fair, and it left the house and the savings to the woman he had been married to for 30 years. Claire contested it. She was married to a lawyer, and she used him like a hammer. She filed a claim alleging that her father, a man Eleanor had nursed to his final breath, had not been of sound mind, that Eleanor had isolated him, manipulated him, that a woman who marries a widower with a child is not a wife at all, but an opportunist, playing a long game. Not one word of it was true. But truth is expensive, and Eleanor was 76, with no income, and a lawyer she was paying out of a savings account, draining like a wound. 9 months. That is how long it took to break her. By the following summer, she had spent everything she had defending herself against a girl she had raised. She could not afford another hearing, and so, in a conference room with gray carpet, Claire's lawyer slid a settlement across the table. Eleanor would waive every claim to Thomas Rourke's estate, the house, the accounts, all of it, to Claire, and in exchange, Eleanor would receive And here Claire insisted on the wording herself, leaning over her husband's shoulder to dictate it, smiling as she did. The Rourke Mountain property, in its entirety, including all contents and improvements. Eleanor looked up. What is that? Claire laughed. It's a shack, Eleanor. 40 acres of rock on a mountain. My great-grandfather built it, and nobody's been up there in 50 years. She capped her pen. There's nothing there. That's rather the point. Eleanor signed. Remember those words, including all contents and improvements. Claire dictated them herself, as an insult, because she was absolutely certain everything on that mountain was worth precisely nothing. They were about to become the most expensive words she would ever speak. If your blood is already boiling, if you want to see Claire get every single thing she has coming, comment the word contents below, and make sure you are subscribed. Because what Claire just signed away, without reading it, is going to end her. Eleanor drove up in the last week of October, in a car packed with everything she still owned, which was not much. The road climbed 11 miles, and then it stopped being a road. It became 2 ruts in the rock, and then nothing at all, and she left the car and walked the last half-mile, with the wind cutting straight through her coat. Then she saw it. The cabin sat in a clearing against a wall of black pines, and it was exactly what Claire had promised. 1 room, a stone chimney with half its stones gone, a roof sagging in the middle like something with a broken back. The door hung open on a single hinge, and inside there was a rusted stove, a rotted bed frame, and 50 years of dust. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the only thing she owned in the world, and the wind came through the walls as if they were not there. It was going to snow, and there was nowhere else to go. So she went inside. She survived that first month on stubbornness, and on a woman named Ruth. Ruth ran the last store before the mountain road, 2 gas pumps and a bell over the door. She was 61, widowed, and losing the place a little more every year to the highway they had built 4 miles east. When Eleanor came in that first week, thin and gray with cold, counting coins out of a coat pocket for a bag of rice, Ruth watched her for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter, took out a ledger, and wrote Eleanor's name in it. "You'll pay me when you can," Ruth said, "and you'll take a stove. I've got my husband's old one out back doing nothing." Eleanor started to cry right there in the aisle, and Ruth pretended not to notice, which was its own kind of kindness. It was Ruth who told her about Amos. "Amos Rourke," she said, wrapping the rice. "Your husband's grandfather. My mother knew him. Strangest man on this mountain, and that is saying something." Eleanor asked what he did. "Nobody ever knew. That's the thing." Ruth shook her head. 4 times a year he'd come down off that mountain with a little locked case, catch the train to the city, and come back 3 days later with nothing. No goods, no packages, nothing at all. She pushed the bag across the counter. And he lived like a pauper. Same coat, 30 years. Folks said he was the poorest man in the county. She paused. Died up there alone. Winter of 74. They didn't find him till the thaw. Eleanor walked back up the mountain in the fading light, and for reasons she could not have explained, she kept thinking about a locked case, and a man who came home with nothing. Now, before Eleanor's crowbar comes down on that floor, and before you find out what Amos Rourke spent 50 years hiding underneath it, do me one small favor. If you are rooting for this woman, hit that like button. It genuinely helps her story reach the people who need to hear it. And if you are new here, subscribe, because what happens next changes absolutely everything. The cold came down off the peaks in December, like something with a grudge. 20 below at night. Then 25. The little stove Ruth had given her ate wood, the way a fire eats paper. And by mid-month, Eleanor had burned everything she could carry. The bed frame, the broken shelf, the fallen branches she dug out from under 3 feet of snow with her bare hands until they bled. And then there was nothing left. She sat in the dark, wrapped in every piece of clothing she owned, watching her own breath, and she understood with a terrible calm that she was going to die in this room. Then she looked down at the floor. The floorboards were old pine, wide as her forearm, and dry. Eleanor found the crowbar in the corner, rusted, left there by a man 50 years dead. She worked the flat end into the seam between 2 boards, and she pulled. The first board came up. She fed it to the stove. The second came up, and she fed that in too, and the fire took. And for the first time in a week, the room began to warm. She went back for a third. She set the crowbar in the seam. She leaned her weight on it, and the metal came down through the gap and struck something underneath. It did not thud. It did not bite. It rang. Eleanor stopped breathing. She lay flat on that freezing floor and put her eye to the gap and saw nothing but darkness. So she took the crowbar and she began to tear, board after board, nails shrieking out of joists 50 years old. Her hands shook and her arms had nothing left in them, and still she tore at that floor until she had opened a hole 4 feet across. And there, in the lamplight, set into a bed of poured concrete, beneath the floor of a shack that was supposedly worth nothing, was a slab of steel. Not a box, not a tin, a door. A great circular door, black with age, with a raised rim and a heavy handle. And in the center of it, a dial. A combination dial. Eleanor Rourke knelt on the ruined floor, with the wind screaming outside, and stared at a bank vault buried under a mountain. And she had no idea how to open it. She tried everything. Thomas's birthday, Amos's, the year the cabin was built, scratched into the beam above the door. She spun that dial in the freezing dark until her fingers would not close, and the handle did not move, and the vault did not care. For 3 days she barely slept, and on the 4th day she stopped trying to guess. She started to look. She went through that cabin, the way you go through the belongings of someone you loved. She emptied the cupboard. She lifted the mattress ticking. She pulled the drawer out of the table and turned it over. And taped underneath, brittle and yellowed, was an envelope. Inside was a photograph. A young woman, standing in front of the cabin in summer, squinting into the sun, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. And on the back, in a cramped and careful hand, Mary. The only thing I ever owned that mattered. 6/14/31. Eleanor looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she went back to the vault, and she knelt down, and with hands she could barely feel, she turned the dial to 6, and to 14, and to 31. The handle moved. The door came up out of the floor, on a hinge that had not turned in 50 years, with a groan like something waking. Beneath it was a chamber, concrete-lined, bone-dry, the size of a small room, and a ladder. Eleanor went down with the lamp in her hand. Steel shelves bolted to the concrete ran the length of the chamber. On them, sorted with the obsessive care of a man who had nothing else in the world to be careful with, were rows of small cloth pouches. She untied one. Into her palm poured stones, a dozen of them, dull, rough, unremarkable, until she turned her hand and the lamplight caught them, and they threw the fire back at her, the way nothing on this earth does except one thing: diamonds. She untied another, and another, rough diamonds, cut diamonds, folded in tissue, sapphires the color of deep water, emeralds, rubies in a paper packet marked in that same cramped hand. And on the lowest shelf, in neat rows, dull yellow and impossibly heavy, bars of gold. Eleanor Rourke sat down on the floor of a vault beneath a mountain, 76 years old, and she could not breathe. The last shelf held the answer. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, filled cover to cover in that careful hand. And beneath it, a single sealed envelope. To Thomas. Amos Rourke had been a gem dealer, not a rich man's dealer, a quiet one. He had learned stones as a boy and built a modest trade buying rough and selling it on in the city, 4 times a year, with a locked case, on a train. And then, in 1938, he was robbed. The ledger recorded it in 3 flat lines. Everything he had, taken out of a strongbox at a bank, that informed him afterwards it was not their responsibility. He was 40 years old, and he was ruined. He never trusted another living soul with anything again. So he started over. And this time he kept it himself. He spent 2 years digging out and pouring a chamber beneath his own floor, bought a vault door out of a demolished bank, and hauled it up that mountain on a wagon in pieces. And for the next 36 years, everything Amos Rourke earned went down that ladder. He never spent it. He wore the same coat. He ate what he grew. The whole county called him the poorest man on the mountain. And every night, he slept 4 feet above one of the great private fortunes of his generation. He meant to tell Thomas. The letter was dated November of 1974. It said he had put it off too long. That a man ought not to carry a thing like this alone. That when the snow cleared in the spring, Thomas should come up, and he would show him what was under the floor. He never sent it. He died that winter, alone, in the room above. And so Thomas Rourke lived his entire life, believing that mountain was worthless. And when he died, his daughter believed it too. Claire had done her arithmetic. She had taken everything she thought had value, and she had handed her stepmother, as an insult, as a punishment, as a thing beneath her notice, the greatest fortune either of them would ever touch, along with a signed document confirming, in Claire's own dictated words, that it came with all contents. If you are sitting there smiling right now, go ahead and hit that like button. She earned every single stone, because Claire was about to find out. Eleanor told no one but Ruth. Ruth closed the store for 2 days, drove her 4 hours to the city, and sat beside her in a gemological laboratory, while a man in white gloves went through the pouches one at a time, and said nothing at all for a very long while. When he finally spoke, he asked Eleanor to sit down. $120 million, give or take. Eleanor, who 3 months earlier had been counting coins in a country store for a bag of rice, put her face in her hands and wept. Not for the money. For a man who died alone 4 feet above it, with a letter he never sent, because he had learned too well what people do to you when you have something worth taking. The rumor reached Claire within the month. She came up the mountain in a car that was not built for it, walked the last half-mile in shoes that were not built for it either, and knocked on the door of the shack she had laughed about. Eleanor opened it. "Mom," Claire said, 30 years. 30 years of packed lunches and school plays, and a hand held out and never taken. And that was the first time she had ever said it. "I was wrong," Claire said, and her eyes slid past Eleanor's shoulder to the new floor. "About everything. We're family. And whatever is here, it was my great-grandfather's. It's Rourke money. It belongs to the family." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the table, picked up a folded document, and brought it back to the door. "Do you know what this is, Claire?" "Mom, it's the settlement you made me sign." Eleanor opened it. "You dictated this clause yourself. I watched you do it. You leaned over your husband's shoulder and told him exactly what to write, and you were smiling when you said it." She read it aloud. "The Rourke Mountain property, in its entirety, including all contents and improvements." She looked up. "Including all contents. You wrote those words, Claire. And do you know why? Because you were so certain everything up here was worthless that you thought naming it was funny." Claire's face had gone very white. "You spent 9 months proving to a judge that I have no claim on anything of your father's. Then you signed a paper handing me this mountain and everything in it. Eleanor folded the document. You made it airtight. You did that, not me. Eleanor, Claire said. Please. You told me I was never family. Eleanor's voice stayed very quiet. You said it in a church parking lot, with your father, an hour in the ground, and I have thought about those 6 words every night for a year. She stood in the doorway of the only thing she had ever been given. So, I am going to do you the courtesy of believing you. And she closed the door. Eleanor Rourke could have gone anywhere after that. She stayed. She rebuilt the cabin into what it should always have been. Warm, solid, lit. She had Amos's letter framed above the stove, so the old man would never be alone in that room again. She bought Ruth's store outright and signed it back to her, free and clear, along with enough that Ruth would never again lie awake at 2 in the morning doing sums. She put a clinic in a town that had never had one. Claire never came back up the mountain. They called it a shack. 40 acres of rock. A punishment for an old woman they were certain had nothing left to lose. But worth has a way of hiding in the places the world refuses to look. In a strange old man everyone called poor. In a stepmother who was never quite family. Under a floor, in the dark, waiting 50 years for the one person who deserved to find it. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. 6 words. In a church parking lot. What would you have said back to Claire? I read every single one, and if you want more stories of quiet people who were counted out, and the justice that found them anyway, subscribe and ring the bell, because there is always another door about to open. Thank you for watching, and never let anyone convince you that you are worth less than you are.